Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the American Academy in Berlin. My name is RJ McGill. I'm the head of communications here at the Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. Thanks for joining us for tonight's Mary Ellen van der Heyden reading with Ayana Mathis, entitled Inflections of Belief. I'll just say a few words about the fellowship and about Ayana and then hand over the floor. The Mary Ellen van der Heyden Fellowship in Letters was established in 2007 and initiated by Karl van der Heyden, a native Berliner founding trustee of the American Academy, its treasurer for over a decade, and at one point also the co-chairman. Karl and his wife, Mary Ellen, have long been committed to philanthropy, funding a library, an art center, and fellowships at their alma mater, Duke University, in addition to significant endowments elsewhere, most prominently at the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Writers and Scholars. The Mary Ellen van der Heyden Fellowship has made possible the residencies of writers including Nathan Englander, Angela Flournoy, Yaa Gyasi, Laurie Moore, Karen Russell, Ben Marcus, and Heidi Julewitz, among many others. And this semester, we proudly add to the list Nell Irvin Painter and Ayana Mathis. It's what Academy President Dan Benjamin would call a twofer. And while it is true that Ayana is the fall 2024 Mary Ellen van der Heyden Fellow, she was in fact awarded a Berlin Prize Fellowship in 2020. That fateful year when a global pandemic made it slightly difficult to have residential fellowships. So we're glad after 4 years that you and Christina are here. Welcome to the American Academy. It was worth the wait, but could have happened twice, really. So just a bit about Ayana. Ayana Mathis received her MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she subsequently became the first African-American woman to hold the position of assistant professor of English and creative writing. Her first novel, The 12 Tribes of Haiti, which came out in 2012, was a New York Times bestseller, the second selection for Oprah's Book Club 2.0, a 2013 New York Times notable book, NPR Best Book of the Year in 2013, and was long listed for the Dublin Literary Award and a finalist for the Hurston Wright Foundation's Legacy Award. No pressure tonight, though. It's all very relaxed, very forgiving crowd. Most recently, Ayana published her novel, The Unsettled, with Knopf last year, which was named also a New York Times and Washington Post notable book of 2023, a best book of 2023 by The New Yorker, Publishers Weekly, and Oprah's Daily Best Novels of 2023, a Kirkus Review's Best Book of 2023 as well, and the novel was a finalist for the 2024 Hurston Wright Legacy Award. And just last month, Ayana was the inaugural winner of the Gabe Hudson Literary Award, which was newly established by McSweeney's. The Unsettled, which is... That was very subtle.
I'm going to bring Nell to all my talk.
Seriously, she's just going to... Your own personal cheering section. Is she paying you? The Unsettled, which was incidentally the project for which Ayana applied to the Academy in 2020, so I can thank the foresight of our selection committee, is now also available in German, published just last week by DTV as Am Flussufer ein Feuer. Am Flussufer ein Feuer. A quick but related aside, for those of you who are avid readers of both German and English, please mark your calendars for November 15th at 7:30. There will be a bilingual reading with Ayana at the Margaschule Buchstube in Charlottenburg. Ayana, I don't think you even have to talk tonight, actually. Mathis's essays, I'm going to switch to your last name. Mathis's essays and criticism have been published in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, T Magazine, the Financial Times, Rolling Stone, Guernica, and Glamour, among many others. And she's currently, interestingly, pursuing her Master's of Divinity at Union Theological Seminary, which explains why her most recent nonfiction explores the intertwining of faith and American literature in her 5-part New York Times essay series, Imprinted by Belief. Oh, that's Inflections. Okay. Her work has been supported by the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. This time I got it right. And see, there you go. She's been good to you. And the Civitelli Ranieri Foundation and the Bogliasco Foundation. Ayana has taught in the MFA writing program at Columbia University and at Rutgers at Newark, and she currently teaches at Hunter College at CUNY in the MFA program. So here's how tonight works. Ayana will come up and speak for 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll go on stage. You can ask questions. Whoever is watching us on our Vimeo live stream, you can ask questions. If you're in the room, obviously, please raise your hand. A microphone will come around to you. If you're online, type your questions into the Q&A. And with that, I will stop talking. And Ayana, the floor is yours.
All right. Y'all just being ridiculous, but that's okay. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here because it's long time coming. As RJ said, 4 years in the making. I am, of course, incredibly grateful to the Academy. Incredibly grateful to my fellows for their brilliance and company. And incredibly thankful to everyone who makes the Academy run and work and makes it possible for us to be here with really nothing to do except think our thoughts and give a talk. So, without further ado, also I never use slides, so there might be some awkwardness. So I'm just warning you all now. This is a talk about an excavation. It is about the depths of those things which have been foundational to me and to my work as a novelist and an essayist. In particular, this evening, I would like to talk to you about belief in various iterations. I will use, for these purposes, the broadest sense of the term, belief as devotion to persons, people, to a faith, at least for a period in my life, and to literature, which has always been salvific in my life. Now, a little caveat before I go any further. I hope that you will allow me to voice a bit of a misgiving. Part of the difficulty in creating this talk is that it must necessarily present a set of ideas in concrete terms that suggest certainty or solid ground. This talk, of course, is more concerned about process than result. It is about questions that arise from the depths. It is about an internal tangle of impulses and wounds and obsessions. These depths are always in flux, perpetually unsettled and unsettling. I must tell you one other related thing. Tomorrow is the first anniversary of my mother's death, who was my great love. In the 364, see, this will happen probably a few times, but don't worry, it's fine. In the 364 days since her death, I find myself more suspicious than ever of pronouncements of certainty, of anything that might imply the triumph of answers over questions. I am especially wary of my own pronouncements, which have to me sometimes the taint of dishonesty simply by virtue of the finished quality of definitive statements, especially those delivered from behind a podium. In reality, the most honest thing that I can tell you in this entire talk is that the exploration of the ideas themselves, that is the doing of the work, is the most honest part of all of it. Not anything that I can ever say about the work. But forge on we will, with grains of salt taken, I hope. In each genre in which I work, fiction and nonfiction, which has thus far included critical and personal essays, I seem to find myself in some confrontation with history. These tend to be histories of survival. In fiction, that means a person or a family or persons doing what they must to survive their moment in history or to thrive in that moment and to love one another all the while. I think here, forgive me a little digression, of James Baldwin's letter to my nephew, which was written in 1962 at the height of the civil rights movement. I'll quote him. "Here you were, to be loved, baby, hard and forever, to strengthen you against the loveless world." This is a multivalent declaration about history and about the political as much as it is about feeling or sentiment. It is also a statement about belief, belief in the loved one's living and thriving, and in that loved one's inalienability. It is also a statement of hope, in that it is undergirded by a profound belief that a livable future is possible for the loved ones, however harrowing the present might be. This line comes to me often, which is why I mention it here, because in its historical, political, emotional, quasi-religious, sort of sacred multivalence, it describes the work that I have tried to do, or at least the work that I aspire to do, across genre. In this sense, my fiction and nonfiction are flip sides of the same coin, or perhaps a better metaphor might be that they are a different set of tools used to excavate the same questions about origin and about bearing up in hard places and about rupture and about belonging. To describe this excavation, I will turn to the poet Adrienne Rich and these lines from her very famous poem, Diving into the Wreck. I came to explore the wreck. The words are purposes. The words are maps. I came to see the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. This evening, the first site of excavation will be fiction, and I will concentrate on my most recent novel, The Unsettled. The Unsettled is a novel about a family fractured by geography, by various cruelties of history, and also by familial estrangement. One of the novel's sources of suspense is this family's attempt to hold on to a piece of land that it has owned for a long time in a fictional place called Bonaparte. Bonaparte is invented, as I've said. In the novel, it is both real and also a little bit mythical, so much so that I created an origin myth for it. And this place is curved around a bend in the Alabama River. It has, in the novel, the air of the sacred, and among its guardians is one of the novel's main characters, a former blues woman named Duchess Carson. Bonaparte is a spiritual and material homeland. The people there have owned that land for generations, and so it is a bulwark against the itinerance and exploitative tendencies so ubiquitous and so very dangerous for Black people in the South. Bonaparte is of equal psychic importance in that it is a place in which these fictional Black characters' humanity was uncontested. Bonaparte held its own for over 100 years, but when we meet it in 1985, the year the book is set, it is besieged. It is reduced from 10,000 acres to 1,000. Its young people have long since migrated north and west, and there are 5 septuagenarians left to hold on to it, Duchess chief among them. Bonaparte, I'll give you a few facts here, is loosely based on a place called Gee's Bend, also in Alabama. You'll know it, if you do, from its very famous quilts. Gee's Bend was originally occupied by enslavers who brought with them enslaved Africans to work the land in 1816. After the Civil War, the people there remained as sharecroppers. After a series of events far too long to list here, though they are very interesting, in 1937, under New Deal initiatives around rural poverty, the government bought the land, carved it up into little parcels, which it sold to the people of Gee's Bend for very little money and with low interest. In this way, after 100 years of living on and tending that land, the people of Gee's Bend came to own the place on which their ancestors had been enslaved. These are a few pictures of Gee's Bend. They're not very good because I took them myself. So, there you go. And house, it is, people still live there. Gee's Bend is by no means abandoned, but this is an old house that no one lives in anymore. It's just a very beautiful place. And it was sort of very much the geographic inspiration and some historical things too for Bonaparte, as I said. My invented Bonaparte is also modeled after Black settlements throughout the South, many of which were founded, I'm talking about real places, many of which were founded during or after the Reconstruction, in those final decades of the 19th century, before in 1896, the Supreme Court ruling Plessy versus Ferguson paved the way for the American apartheid known as Jim Crow. Autonomous Black places also have a long presence in the African American literary canon. Most will be familiar, of course, with Zora Neale Hurston, who was herself raised in one such independent autonomous settlement, which is called Eatonville, located in Florida. It is gestured to in much of her writing, most famously, of course, in Their Eyes Are Watching God. But as I said, there are a number of places like this. There's Eatonville, very old photograph. There's Zora Neale Hurston. This is a place called Freetown in Alabama. There are few inhabitants left, but not very many at all. This is Mound Bayou, which also still exists, very, very sparsely populated, but it is sort of holding on to itself. As you can see, it was founded in 1887. Oh, that's different. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay. So these are these kind of years in which there was this kind of, I was about to say mingled progress, but that's actually not fair. It was in fact progress. It was, however, intermixed with a great deal of violence and all sorts of other things. But they were important years for Black people in the United States. The aftermath of those years, though, are difficult for the reasons we know, Jim Crow, et cetera, but they're also difficult because of what happened to some of those places that Black people founded and some of the land that they managed to acquire in those late years of the 19th century. I'll offer some numbers to put some of this into perspective. By about 1910, Black farmers owned almost 16 million acres of land in the United States. By 1997, more than 90% of that land was lost. It was lost to things like eminent domain. It was lost to theft. It was lost to people being quite literally run off of the land by violent white mobs. It was lost in many, many ways. The value of that land, conservatively, is about $326 billion with a B. You can imagine those numbers are shocking, and the implications of that loss is profound. As a fiction writer, what moves me about all of this, what undergirds the fictional project that was The Unsettled, are the people in those numbers. Names and faces and personalities and proclivities. People who, in their historical and material situation, with all of that physical, psychic, and legislative violence aimed at them, people who made a place and then lost it or were able to keep it, people who had their children or didn't, who left those places to hurt their children or tried to, people who were heroic or cowardly, who were wise or who were foolish, who were gentle or who were cruel. In any case, imperfectly, miraculously human in the face of overwhelming dehumanization. Now, the other pole in this novel, The Unsettled, is Philadelphia, where I grew up. Philadelphia is home to Duchess Carson's, that kind of custodian of Bonaparte. Philadelphia is home to her estranged daughter, a woman named Ava, who left Bonaparte as a young woman, and Ava's 11-year-old son, Toussaint. There are two sites in Philadelphia that are important in this novel. The first that we encounter when it opens, is a place of utter and complete dislocation, a homeless shelter. And the other place is a kind of separatist Black radical group. It's a little bit Black Panthers, a little bit Weather Underground, a little bit occult. That group is called ARC, with a K, importantly, they like to say. I know, you're like, what, you wrote them, and they just do their own thing. Anyhow, ARC, like Bonaparte, has a historical correlative, a group called MOVE, which existed in Philadelphia from the late 1960s onwards and still exists now in a kind of a form. If you know the story of MOVE, which many will not and probably do not, I'll tell it to you now. So as I said, MOVE was a group that was a radical Black separatist group, came into existence around the end of the 60s. They were deeply politicized. They were difficult in certain ways because in many ways they were ahead of their time. They did things like in the 70s and 80s, they composted, they were vegans, they believed in cooperative economics, all these sorts of things. They were also really heavily armed and are a massive pain in the ass. So they tended to sort of take over a row house. Philadelphia, as I said, where I'm from, a lot of the architecture is row houses. So all these houses kind of attached to one another, often wooden, at least in some part. So they would tend to sort of make compounds out of a row house, and they would do things like put rainwater collection barrels on the roof, and to further add to the pain in the assness, they would kind of yell at people from bullhorns, and they were difficult neighbors. Difficult neighbors. In any case, you can imagine also, however, that they, in as much as they were politically quite radical, politically very much interested in Black self-determination, they had a lot of run-ins and difficulty with the Philadelphia Police Department repeatedly. These happened over the years, over the decades of their existence. The most known of which happened on May 13th in 1985. On that day, in May 13th, 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department decided that they would move the group from this row house. They evacuated both sides of the block. It's about 60 homes. And an armed standoff ensued. It was a siege, really. It lasted 12 to 14 hours, something like that, during which MOVE, also armed, were fired house. This went on and on and on. Finally, good. And the police chief said, well, what are we going to do? This is just, we don't know what to do. What they decided to do to resolve the problem was to drop a C4 military-grade explosive from a helicopter onto the roof of the house. Both sides of the block, as you can imagine, went up in flames. 60 homes are lost, 240 people, about 65 to 70 families are displaced. Most significantly, however, there were 13 people in the MOVE house, 2 of whom got out, a little boy who I'll talk about in a minute, and a woman named Ramona Africa. All of the members of MOVE took the last name Africa. But we can do the math. That means 11 people were left inside, 5 of whom were children, all of whom were murdered. The fire could be seen all over the city. There's an example of it. This is the block after. My arc, the group in my book, is not MOVE, in part because MOVE remains, as you can imagine, a raw wound in Philadelphia. The storyline of my group arc ends differently, not well by any means, but not in the deaths of all the people involved. In some ways, it's because I could not bear to murder all of those people all over again, even if only in the pages of my novel. In the second place, my group arc, though in homage and absolutely in conversation with what happened in MOVE, is not MOVE, because my point of contact with these people, my point of interest in these people, was not their deaths, but their lives. I did not want death nor suffering to define them. And besides, I had other questions about them. What might lead people to take the risk that these people took in establishing a countercultural commune, particularly in the mid-1980s when the taste for that sort of thing was very much waning? What is the experience of being a pariah or of making yourself pariahs? What are the pains and privations of a kind of existence so far out onto the margins? But also, what are the wonders of such a thing? What sort of intensity of belonging? Ava, one of the characters that I mentioned who becomes a member of ARC, she says, and I'll quote the book here She says it better than I could. She says just after she asks the leader of ARC to shave her head, he's done this, and she says, or the book says, she ran her hand over the new velvet of her scalp, joyous. Up she floated like a kite, over the rooftops and the street lights and the tree line. Not free. She didn't want that anyway. Jubilant. Arc and Bonaparte, in my mind, both of these places, are iterations of devotion to place and what that sort of devotion means and does in the life of a family and of a people. These people in this book, in both of those places, are true believers. For better and for worse, with all of their flaws and various corruptions, they put it all on the line for devotion to one another, out of devotion to an idea of freedom and to this strange and very flawed attempt to create a livable alternative to those aspects of America that they believed were failing them because they were failing them economically and politically and in any number of other ways. I'm going to show you one more picture. Ava's son I mentioned, who also lives in ARC, is a boy named Toussaint. And this is a kid, one of the two survivors of the fire. Those are burns on his arm. He's in the back of a police car. His name was Birdie Africa. He's 13 years old. And I kept this picture next to my writing desk, tacked up on like a bulletin board. All the many, many years I was writing this damn book. Because I wanted always to think, who is this kid? Not just what does he mean, but who is he? Could I imagine my way into this kid? So I put him up here right now because I think these folks in Bonaparte and these folks in ARC and also the folks in MOVE and the people in Mound Bayou and the people in all these places that we've mentioned, Gee's Bend and on and on and on, we're talking too about true believers when we talk about them too, because these are people who are talking about making a legacy, making something that is born out of a painful, barely livable present and an even more painful past, but making something that could make the future, a future, possible for their children. So what we're talking about is hope. And there's nothing greater than that if we want to talk about belief. I was 11 years old. I'm from Philadelphia. So I was 11 years old when the MOVE bombing happened. And no one in my family ever spoke of it with me or in my hearing. Something about what happened there, aside from the obvious, clearly, pained them so deeply that they couldn't speak of it. And that would include the obvious, of course. At the same time that the MOVE people, they all had big dreadlocks and with their locks and their kind of anti-everything rebel stance, the spectacle, I think, of MOVE, so I think my family understood them to be, there was something about them that made my mother and my grandparents feel ashamed. And maybe it made me feel ashamed too. Maybe that's also true. It probably is. It could be, at least then. That, the shame, is down there in the wreck that I want to explore with you this evening. The 1980s were a great decade for Black shame. They were a great decade for Black shame and for gay shame and for AIDS shame and for poor people shame. The Reagan years were a shame machine, fueled on ideas. A shame machine fueled on ideas of defilement, of who was defiled and who was defiling and who ought to be contained and who ought to be removed and how. The Unsettled, that book, set in the 1980s when I was a child and an adolescent, in no small part was, I realized later, an excavation of the complex web of my own shames. Race shame, shame about being poor, shame about being in and of a margin. The book, of course, is equally about the antidotes to that shame, which are love and striving to create conditions and places in which personhood could be possible. But writing fiction is tricky business. It tends to expose you. It demands further exploration. In this case, it demanded further exploration of things that I had really spent quite a whole lifetime trying to defend myself against. In the aftermath of that book's writing, I am left face to face with the questions that motivated that book. I am left with, as Adrienne Rich wrote in another part of that poem I showed you at the outset of the talk, I'm left with the wreck and not the story of the wreck. I am forced to dive into, quote, the damage that was done and the treasures that prevail. The treasure, that treasure, is bound up with the belief that I spoke of at the outset of this talk. Belief as devotion to my mother and to my family, to the religion that shaped much of my young life, and also to books, which have always been a place of devotion. I think that perhaps I am also talking about faith, which I will describe here as perpetual participation with its object. The most recent nonfiction iteration of this part of the excavation began in the relative emotional safety of criticism, that is, at a comfortable distance or a comfortable remove from the personal. I began writing essays for the New York Times entitled Imprinted by Belief. That series, which RJ so generously mentioned in his introduction, considers American fiction, mostly contemporary, in terms of its Judeo-Christian imprinting. I looked at books like Toni Morrison's *The Mercy* and Louise Erdrich's *Plague of Doves*, the brilliant Gina Berriot's extraordinary short story, *The Overcoat*, among many, many others. If indeed America was founded on Christian hegemony and supremacy, can we suppose that, even in our contemporary, supposedly increasingly secular times, can we actually suppose that that imprinting has been erased from our literature? And if we don't recognize this stuff, how can we re-examine what is harmful, what has damned us and continues to damn, at the same time that we might be able to embrace what's useful? The series sought to look at this literature through a series of existential and/or theological categories: the prophetic, forgiveness, suffering and evil, apocalypse. In what ways were the books I chose in conversation with these things, was the question I was asking. And in what ways did those books present more generous, more useful alternatives to our received notions of some of these things? Is forgiveness only and ever transactional? Does it actually mean that we have to turn the other cheek? And if it does, where does that leave the offender and where does that leave the aggrieved? Perhaps, for example, Alice Walker's *The Color Purple* might have something to say about that. And in fact, it does. In any case, I loved writing those essays. And I loved how demanding they were. And I loved the rigor that they required. So I thought, okay, I'll make a book out of them. Fantastic. But then, as I began preparing the sales pitch, otherwise known as the book proposal, the project became bigger than I envisioned or even wanted. It tendrilled out like a drop of black ink in a glass of water. Why this subject in the first place? I found myself asking, what am I getting at here? And what, by extension, am I avoiding? Here's one of the things. I'm a child of the church. In my family, this meant services 3 times a week and twice on Sundays. It meant Jim and Tammy Faye Baker on the television and family radio always on in the car. When I was 9 years old, I was saved. That is, I gave my life to Christ at evening service one Sunday. The week before, my grandparents had taken my mother to a psychiatric ward in the afternoon while I was at school. I returned home that day to find my grandparents near mute with heartbreak, unable to offer more than the barest details about where my mother was or when she would come home. In the month before, she had begun to believe that my grandparents, with whom we lived in New Jersey at that time, were poisoning us. and she believed we could not eat the food they'd touched, nor could they touch ours. She was at turns remote and erratic, and also loving, and also very present. She prayed constantly. She never slept. After some weeks, my mother returned from the hospital, but in the years that followed, her illness was unabated. It worsened through the years of my childhood and my adolescence. It gathered force, and it pulled everything into itself. She and I became estranged from my larger family, and we lived a transient, pillar-to-post, paycheck-to-paycheck kind of a life. Sometimes there were no paychecks. Our housing was unstable. During our worst years, when I was a teenager, I left the church. That faith in Christ was supplanted by another, and that was a faith in books, which shaped my life from a very young age. Books were an escape hatch, and they were a source of revelation. Also, at the same time, with regard to church specifically and my leaving it, I was sick of all the strictures, and I was sick of the fact that the answers to the big questions often struck me as facile and sometimes cruel. But most of all, and here we return to shame, I was ashamed. I was ashamed of the praying and the supplication, and I didn't want to be a sparrow that God had his eye on. I wanted to be a lion. After I left the church, ever after, I found that I had gained my freedom, but I had lost something very precious and foundational. And that something had to do with devotion, and it had to do with belonging, and it had to do with other things of great importance that I can only describe to you in snippets. They are things like my grandmother's hand with her beat-up wedding ring tapping the pew in front of us at Sunday service. They had to do with these lines from a poem that my grandfather wrote when he was in his 90s and nearing his death. I quote, "My time is done, the race is run, don't cry for me, I'm going home." My mother and grandparents' faith had taken them through the worst parts of their lives, and because of its action in their lives, they emerged battered, sure, but on the whole, compassionate, decent, whole people. But of course, I had that darn shame to contend with, my own. And religion was linked, in my mind, with being poor and being black and with limit. And all of this was further bound to and exacerbated by my coming of age in the moment of Reagan's shame machine. Reagan cut about $140 billion in social services and programs, from food stamps to low-income housing, all during the years in which my mother and I and many people needed those things the most. It was a terrible time to be poor, and a truly lousy time to be black and poor. Most of the time, the black people I saw on TV and in pop culture in those years were being arrested, or selling or doing drugs, or wandering around the ghettos in which they, so pop culture had it, all lived. Frequently, they were some iteration of Reagan's favorite societal scourge, the welfare queen. And of course, her opposite was the other prominent 80s iteration of blackness, now shamed, but then we didn't know that, the Cosby's perfectly middle-class, sweatered family. There they are. Sweaters. So we, young black people, particularly young poor black people, were raised on a steady diet of images that showed us as unworthy, as ugly, as peripheral. Most of us survived, of course, but we sure took a beating, politically, economically, and psychically. Despite all of this, and despite my best efforts, the church never left me. To paraphrase James Baldwin, a fierce critic of Christianity, especially in its American iterations, he said once that the church was indelible in him. And it wasn't the doctrine and the dogma of which he spoke, nor is the doctrine and dogma what I am talking about. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about aesthetics, but I'm also talking about an orientation toward belief, toward faith, toward the sacred. Not necessarily religious, certainly not in the way that I lived it as a child. What I can tell you about that is that the difficulties of my young life are not the whole story. In the same way that being murdered is not Move's whole story, nor suffering Black people's whole story. As significant as the hardest years of my mother and my life were, is the fact that she and I survived them. That we were not lost irretrievably and forever, and how we stayed intact is my foundational preoccupation. And it is the subject of a book-length nonfiction project tentatively titled My Brief Salvation that I have begun work on, sort of, and will work on more while I'm here. My mother and I survived because belief in its many iterations saved us. My mother was a very religious woman. She believed that God knew every hair on our heads and every thought in our minds. God's eye was on us, she believed, and he, to use the old-fashioned gendering of the church of my youth, protected us and would bring us through whatever the circumstances of our lives. Despite my teenage skepticism, I had left the church by then, I too held this belief only in secret, though my version was more contested and angry and full of questions. Above all else, my mother and I believed in each other. She knew beyond any shadow of any doubt that I would have a future that our circumstances belied. She marched toward it, never letting go of my hand. In turn, I believed in her. I believed in her determination and her fierce intelligence, and I believed that she would rescue us from the worst situations, and she always did, even when she was the architect of those situations. I believed in her love and my family's as much as I ever had in any Bible verse. That is to say, I experienced my mother's love religiously, in the way of a person who is powerless before and awed and buoyed by a force that is beyond their comprehension and their control. Devotion, that sort of devotion, belief, and these considerations, or perhaps I should call them reconsiderations of devotion that I've talked to you about this evening. These things are addressed in their political and social context, and they undergird my critical essays about religion's imprinting in literature in the same way that they undergird the more personal exploration of belief's role in my own life and my family's life. In the critical essays, these reconsiderations are directed toward the social and historical. In the personal essays, they are brought to bear on these explorations of love and family and identity. But it's always the same sets of questions, always the same tangle of wounds and balms that I explore in my fiction. I will end here with this brief excerpt from Marie Howe's astounding poem, Magdalene the Seven Devils. It expresses with such elegance this plumbing of the depths that I have attempted to describe to you this evening. For months, I dreamt of knuckle bones and roots, the slabs of sidewalk pushed up like crooked teeth by what grew underneath. The underneath, that was the first devil. It was always with me, and that I didn't think you, if I told you, would understand any of this. Thank you so much for diving with me through my underneath. I do. Thank you.
I'm going to take a beat here.
Oh, thanks.
I don't. Is that on, Ragnar?
Yeah.
I don't have any questions that could measure how incredible that talk was. The crazy irony, and we talked about this just briefly, I was 13 when Move happened, and in Philadelphia. So we talked about that briefly. We don't have to go into it now, but it would be great to talk about later. I have a softball question.
Okay.
To get things started after we come out of the depths. You talked eloquently about religion and about the power of literature. The softball question is, what is similar between these two things? A lot of people have written about it over the decades. What is similar about the impetus of faith and religion, and what the sort of secularized version, which we'd call literature, over the last years? What do those things do that are similar in your view?
I mean, I suppose it depends on who you ask, but if you ask me, fiction is necessarily bound up utterly always in two things: human beings generally, or beings of some sort, and time. There's a famous E.M. Forster quote in which he says, in the novel, there is always the clock. And the clock we could interpret in different ways, right? There's the normal clock that might pace a novel. It's Monday, it's Tuesday, it's lunch, it's dinner, blah, blah, blah. But the big clock that gives human life urgency on the page, whether we're thinking about it or not, is the grave, right? Like, that's the ultimate clock. Things become more important because they're in sequence, and the sequence is leading to, well, not being, right? And so in some ways, this effort, I think, to understand or to grasp or to at least be in conversation with a human being's relationship to the ultimate clock, these seem to me, in my estimation, these are also religious questions, or can be, and they're fictional questions. There's something very similar there in this urge to sort of explore what is consequential in this kind of line of consequence that we call time.
Do you also think, we'll open it up in just 1 second. Do you also think, I was thinking that you went for the big picture, in terms of empathy. I mean, it seems that I've never heard Move, I'm admittedly ignorant about it, but I've never heard it spoken about so sort of ethically or so empathetic, with such empathy, that the work of literature does the work of empathy that faith or that religion doesn't, just in terms of
we hope it does. Sometimes it does not.
Sometimes it does not. That's true. Sometimes it does not. But in basic, motions of kindness and understanding, and just trying to sort of put yourself in someone else's place.
I mean, I think one of the things maybe that happens is, some people will be familiar with the writer Marilynne Robinson, and who's often thought of as a religious writer, and I guess that she is kind of. I don't know that she would say that, or she might. But in any case, she's also deeply a person of faith, and one of the things, I was her student, and one of the things that she would impress upon us was writing against the reduction of human beings, right? That was part of the job, was not to make people into these kind of flat ciphers, either of some plot that you want to impose upon them or of some agenda or whatever. And part of her sense, and that's a statement about craft, and it's a statement about literature, and it's a statement about good writing, but it is also, I think, for her as a deeply religious person, it is a statement about not underestimating the capacity of a human being, which is a creature of God. And so also, I think in that way, for me, there is a similar, like that empathy of which you speak is also about fullness, right? Like envisioning a full human being. It doesn't mean likable or good necessarily, just means complete, so that you don't flatten. And that too, that sense in which beings are sometimes loathsome, but still kind of sacred.
Thank you. Okay, now's your chance. If you're in the room, to note again, please raise your hand. A microphone will find you. If you are joining us in the live stream, please type your questions into the Q&A. Michael.
Wanted to ask about genre. and a little bit with the Adrienne Rich poem
Mm.
in mind, and the points that you were making about the relationship between religion and literature, and just to ask about the confessional mode as a genre. And I guess you could think on the one hand about audience, but I think also about what the writer achieves through the confessional mode, and if that's of interest to you, and if that's a part of your writing style.
It is of interest to me, I think, less as a writer and more as a reader. Also, what is always of interest to me, I mean, we know what we mean about the confessional style sort of as a literary confusion, but as a reader and a person who teaches writing, I often think about this sort of like confessing to whom, you know, the sort of the implied you was in, let's say, Murray Howe's poem, right? I don't think you would understand any of this, and there's a great deal of power in who we think that you might be. So it's a bit of a departure from your question, but the things that I have found most useful in as a writer, in any sense, in the confessional sort of style of things, has been this idea of telling something to a you, and who I think that you might be.
Thank you, Ayana. That was very moving, and I'm sort of almost reticent to ask this question because it's a personal one, but I hope you'll allow me. So when you mentioned that your mother had saved you from situations that she was the architect of, there's a kind of circular situation there. And I'm wondering to what degree you, and I'm curious, you know, as you study religion onwards in your career, to what degree you see religion as perhaps part of that circularness, and why are you studying it? And because you've left the church, from what I understand, you haven't gone back. So what sort of work is it doing for you to study it as an outsider?
That's a really great question. I think, and a hard one to answer in a way that's succinct. What I've found, I think, over the years, two things. First is that I have all this stuff, as you sort of heard at the opening of the talk, when I was kind of like, I'm wary of fraudulence, and I'm wary of dishonesty, and I'm, you know, and I'm wary of that in my own work very much. And I'm wary of what I'm hiding behind or hiding from, etc. And there's this sense in which these ideas of shame and of trying to sort of get down into that and try to figure out what it is very much linked to the kind of, what's the word I want to use? And these are impulses I'm talking about here, right? Like this sort of, I don't know if you can always connect the dots, but something about the supplication and at moments almost abjection of people before an altar in my childhood. These are really basic. This is the level of image. So I'm not answering your question yet about studying it. Like this is the level of really of imprinting, right? And how for a long time, as I said in the talk, I was sort of ashamed about that. And then, among other things, I was probably ashamed more of the need for supplication, not for the act of it. And then I began to think that it was actually really, as much as it's mingled and painful, it's sort of incredible that there was a place where a person like my grandmother, who was the most stoic, I mean, the woman said 6 words her whole life, really, she never, you know, where she could weep. And other people like her could weep. And so I started to think, well, who the hell do I think I am? To go, oh, those people are sheep. They don't know what. I mean, these people lived in a week through what I've been through my whole, you know. And these were the means by which they were survived. And so, among other things, of course. So to discount them or devalue them, first was a sort of personal work, But then as I got older, I looked around and I thought, well, are we also discounting and devaluing these things intellectually? Like, why is religion delegitimized as a subject? There's a lot of answers to that question, of course. But part of what I think is motivated now, to get to the part of your question about studying it, is also that, you know, why is this not a legitimate line of inquiry for a thinking person? So that's one reason. And in terms of kind of benefit, what I think one of the things that I have always found, not always, once I stopped being so mad about church, um, and there's still a lot of things about church that I'm mad at, right? Like there's all the homophobia and there's all this, you know, this is not a pie in the sky vision where I'm like, it really was just, you know, I mean, there are problems. But not but slash and maybe. I think there were these ways in which, and this also speaks to the circular part, the circularity thing. There are these ways in which the questions posed about what does it mean that we die? Why do we suffer? How do human beings bear up under these things? The ways in which those questions are posed often seem to me to be incredibly eloquent and incredibly close to human experience, right? Like, you know, I don't know, David outside of the gates after his son has betrayed him, you know, like waiting for the rider to come. And he's so dramatic. That's the other thing, right? I mean, he's out there, he's outside of the gates and he's waiting for this rider to come after there's this battle with his son Absalom who's tried to betray him and you know, it's all going on. And there he is. And a rider comes across and he says, "What news have you of the boy Absalom?" And there's no news. Meanwhile, we know that Absalom has been murdered. And then the second rider comes along. "What news have you of the boy Absalom?" And he finds out that his son has been murdered. And he just weeps and he throws the dirt on himself and he rends his clothes. This is the great king of the Old Testament, weeping in the dirt. You know, these sorts of things, there's something deep and profound and human in so many of these stories. And they tend to be multivalent and bear reconsideration. And I think that that's a lot. And for a fiction writer, the whole job is exploring implicate. That's the whole thing. It's to put some beings in a place, move them around, and explore the implications out and out and out and out and out of what they do and what they feel. It's the whole job. And so there's a lot there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. My question is about your creative process. As many great writers do, your stories are drawing heavily from your personal experiences and from your history, and not just your own. My question is, as a non-expert on fiction writing, do these things ever hinder your imagination? Because a big part of writing is imagination. So how do imagination and reality, personal experience and history work together? Can they sometimes work against each other? If you can say anything about this, it'd be great.
That's a terrific question. And I think for me, in any case, it has changed project to project. There's a couple of things I can say that I generally try to do or not to do. One is that I tend not to do a heavy amount of researching up front. That is, like, I've discovered that memory and these sort of things that are embedded in you from experience and things you've heard, there are a lot of, like, we're all these treasure troves walking around. We really are. It's quite astounding. And you, if you put yourself into a position in which you need some of these things, they come. They make themselves available to you, which is a really astounding discovery. In any case, so I try not to do a tremendous amount of research up front because I do have exactly the problem that you were hinting at, which is that then it starts to become some kind of blueprint or a paint by numbers, and I'm like filling in facts or something, and I feel too hemmed in, and there's not enough room for the imagination to work, which the imagination, I described it to I was somewhere and I described it as a weird feral gremlin running around peeing on everything, which really I think is kind of what, like that's what it is, So you can't like hem it in too much or it won't, won't pee on stuff, and that's what you need to do. And so that's part of the answer. And then what I tend to do then is fact check on the back end. So, if I find myself totally out of my like, okay, I have absolutely no idea, then I'll try to read things that are very narrative in nature. So like I'll try to look for archives that might, like let's say I'm researching a family in a particular situation or a particular historical moment. What I'll try to find are first person accounts because I want narrative. Like I always want the story about the thing. And then again, filling in stuff on the back end. So that I think there was a second part of your question that the gremlin took it, but was there a second part? I think there was. In any case, yeah. So that's what I do think that those things can be in tension with one another. And so in order to avoid it, I just make it up. And then and then kind of fact check on the back end to make sure I haven't gone completely off the rails. Now I was going to ask a hard question.
Yeah. But you can do it. You can really.
See, she's totally going to ask a hard question. She's like encouraging me.
You can do it. I know you can do it. So you started with real history. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these are real places, and they're places that are, you identified them as Black places by race. Mm-hmm. And then with this beautiful narrative, it's kind of like Photoshop layers, taking us from those places, which are also Southern places, into Philadelphia and with Move. I lived in Philadelphia at that time, but I was not in Philadelphia at the time of the bombing. And my best friend was, we were both just, how can this be? And she said, the mayor is Black. Yeah. In addition, but that's just a layer here. And then you end up.
It's really there's a lot of layers. And he got reelected.
Story. Yeah.
He also got reelected.
With a particular kind of religion. It's not the religion I grew up with. Particular kind of religion. Are you pulling those close together where you ended up and where you started off? Are you making that particular kind of religion part of the identity of Bowley in those places?
Yeah, no, okay, I see what you're saying. No, I don't think that I am. I think, for example, in the Unsettled, there's people who are because I'm sort of interested in Black and also in American experiences of religiosity and of faith. And so, and my characters tend to be Black, so that always is sort of the point of departure. So in the Unsettled, for example, in Bonaparte, their religious practice, for example, they don't call God God, they call God the everlasting. They kind of, they have a kind of faith practice that is like a sort of syncretized, right? So like a little bit of the Christianity that was kind of foisted on them, and then a lot of kind of stuff about the natural world and just sort of different sorts of things. So that's their kind of, iteration of things. Ava, the sort of daughter of Bonaparte, she's really not into any of it. Ava is a believer in the grandeur of what Bonaparte was, but not much else. She's not even really a political person, much less a religious one. Then there is an Episcopalian priest in this book who is much more sort of conventionally Christian religious. So there are different iterations, I think. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah, like I'm always interested in sort of like what does this look like in different kinds of ways, in different configurations.
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for this really super amazing talk. It's
Thank
really
you.
difficult for me now to phrase my question because as you talked about all these questions of faith, religion, fantasy, literature, there are sometimes, even if you have like an idea in your head, they're sometimes hard to come up with a term for it. So my question always is, as a writer, somebody who is making up stories and identifying characters and building up characters, that gives you a certain kind of fantasy. Like you have a certain ability to fantasize about things. Religion also requires this kind of belief in things that through natural science we might see as unrealistic or not visible. Being a writer and being able to create those characters, does this give you more of an idea to believe in these stories or religious figures or religious possibilities, of vast possibilities that go beyond just what we see through natural science? Or is it more because of a writer you're able to see through plots and you're writing things yourself that you always come into this idea of you know what, it is a story but it's just literature. Like you could see the Bible as literature, or you could see it through a lens of, okay, this goes beyond what maybe natural science can explain. So it's like interesting, what does literature give us here?
Yeah. I mean, I think I suppose in both, I kind of never thought about it in that way, but I mean, I suppose in both there is the element of faith, right? Like, things hoped for and not seen type of thing, right? And that certainly is, I think, the case, particularly when you're writing, because it's not seen and you got a lot of hope for it. But jokes aside, I mean, I think there is that sense, right? Like there's this sort of sense of trying to make something where there wasn't anything. But I think maybe perhaps even more particularly the sort of the intensity of the labor, which also like the kind of rigor that is required to make a piece of fiction that can stand up at all, often feels to me sort of outside of the ways in which which I sort of generally think about things in my daily life. I don't, and there is, I think, in my mind something sort of sacred about that, like the sort of the intense rigor of the labor. I also think, and the faith that labor, I'm not even talking about an end product, but the faith that labor will get you to the next page. I'm not even talking about like, published or whatever, but the faith that it will get you somewhere. That is certainly something that's involved. I think narrative, I think also you sort of mentioned it, I mean, I'm not, though the faith tradition in which I was raised very much believed in absolute literal interpretation of the Bible. That is not what I believe at all. But I do believe in the narrative potential of biblical literature deeply. And I do believe that literature is often multivalent, and I do believe that it sort of forces us to kind of think about each other and our humanity and God, I guess, if you want to, but not if you don't necessarily, in ways that sort of push the envelope of the way that we think about these things that are going through our normal everyday lives. Not sure if that answers your question, but.
One more question, Max.
Max! Sure.
I'm going to ask 2 questions. Ignore whichever one is uninteresting to you.
Okay.
So my first question is about mapping. both you and Nell used this, I don't want to say metaphor, but you talked about mapping the underneath, mapping the wreckage, right? And mapping can be such a colonial enterprise, naming and ordering the world around you, and that's not how either of you are using it. So I was wondering if you wanted to pull a little more on that thread of mapping. That's one set of questions. I have like 15 sets, but I'm going to ask you. The other set of questions were about whether we're telling our own story or historical story, that tension between the kind of tragic aspects, the abject aspects of that story. And you said, I don't know exact words, but you were talking about not wanting that to be the definition of those figures, right? So how you balance that tension between, remembrance, resilience, however you want to think about that.
Well, those are both really good questions. Maybe I'll answer both. I'll start with the second one. The second one is maybe a shorter answer, which is, I think always in narratives around, and I'll limit myself to the U.S. context in particular, narratives around people who have been the objects of extraordinary violence. There is this tendency to reduce them to vectors of that violence, which is basically what you're saying, right? Like these sort of endlessly multiplying vectors of their pain or what's been, and sometimes it can be hard to talk about because then it's like, well, if you don't do that, then it's like, are you denying are you denying history? Which is a real thorny question these days where books are being banned all over the place and the whole thing. But I think it probably has to do with trying not to think in binaries. Stuart Hall, who, if people know him, cultural critic, etc., brilliant all around. He talked a lot about not liking exactly the oppressor binary, because he said that if you make these kinds of bifurcations, you deny the idea that the oppressed had any agency at all. That inside of what was happening to them, they were just these sort of flattened vectors of pain who were only reacting to their pain and their oppression and violence, and who had no kind of agency themselves. And so his sort of advocacy was to kind of reject the zero sum, right? Reject the binary of it's this or it's that, and instead try to think about histories and people. And he was always writing about Black people, generally always, to kind of live in this kind of space that's in between, right? That isn't, it's all oppression, it's all, So that's the second question, or at least a partial answer. To the first question about mapping, I'm trying to think of how to order this. I think that a lot of this book, and also my first book, and probably this nonfiction book, is about this idea of people for whom there is no official record. And there's no official record by virtue, of course, of race. There's no official record by virtue of poverty. There's no official record also by virtue of sort of circumstance, right? If I think about my life with my mother, my mother's passed away. She was also unwell for part of it, so she has a version. I was a kid, and there was no one else around. So what's the record? Like, who is? I know, but in this, now is a story. I'm like, I have to be careful. She's gonna get mad. But there's not. So it's like, well, what can I make? Even if I can't sort of say, oh, these are the family photos, or these are the which I have like 5 probably, quite literally. So how do I talk about she and I? How do I talk about the fact that we loved each other? How do I talk about the fact that what happened to us and who we were was important, that it mattered in the absence of artifacts of some sort? And so that personal question, which I guess is sort of in keeping with this whole talk, that personal question then informs also the fiction and all the rest of it. So I guess I'm interpreting maps kind of broadly also as like documentation in a certain way. So there's that. And I think the other thing is a certain amount of skepticism about certain kinds of documentation. So the people in Bonaparte, for example, in the novel, they, by various means, they end up all kind of owning these parcels of land. And its height, this place Bonaparte, is like 10,000 acres, and it's quite glorious and this whole sort of thing, right? And they have these deeds, and the deeds are very important. Nonetheless, by the time we meet Bonaparte in 1985, it's 1,000 acres. So the permanence and the stability and the respectability and all of the rest of it that was supposed to be conferred by this piece of paper did in fact not do that, and does in fact not do that for some people. And so also bound up with this question of sort of like of records and mapping and documentation is also a deep skepticism about what the documents can do, because they don't always do it for all the people all the time. I'll stop there.
And we'll stop there too and give you a round of applause.